History of the USA. The land of the present-day U.S. has known human settlement for more than 12,000 years. The early Americans are believed to have come from Asia by crossing the land bridge that existed between Asia and North America. They foraged, hunted, built villages, grew crops and engaged in trade. Over time, some early groups disappeared and were replaced by other tribes of Native Americans. When Europeans, probably Norse people traveling west from Greenland, first arrived in North America in the 11th century, at least 2 million native people were estimated to be living in what is now the U.S. It took another 500 years before other European explorers, notably the British, Dutch, French and Spanish, came to what they called the New World. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, but he did not set foot on the mainland on this voyage. 5 years later, John Cabot of Venice arrived in Newfoundland on a mission for the King of England, providing the basis for British claims to North America. The first British settlement to take hold, Jamestown of Virginia, was not established until over 200 years later, in 1709. By the late 17th century, 250,000 people, mostly from England, had settled on the eastern coast of America. Some colonists came to the New World to escape religious restrictions or persecution. Many came for political freedom and economic opportunity. 13 distinct colonies evolved: the New England colonies, the Middle colonies and the Southern colonies of Georgia, Maryland, North and South Carolina and Virginia. As the settlements expanded, the Native Americans, who were called Indians, were forced to move, often after being defeated in battle. As the colonies grew, assemblies were set up to serve as local parliaments, which often got into dispute with the British-appointed royal governors. At the First Continental Congress in 1774, representatives from each colony except Georgia gathered to assert colonial rights and call on the British to change their policy. However, Britain retaliated by introducing more oppressive measures. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington, Massachusetts, on the 13th of April 1775. Colonial representatives meeting in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress voted to go to war with Britain and appointed George Washington of Virginia the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. On the 4th of July 1776 they approved the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson. The date is officially recognized as the birth of the United States of America, although it was not until the 3rd of September 1783 that the British signed the Treaty of Paris, conceding American independence. The Constitution, signed on the 17th of September 1787, provided the framework for the U.S. government structure. The federal government would have 3 equal branches: legislative, executive and judicial, with balanced powers and checks against each other's actions. It would have full power to issue currency, levy taxes, grant patents, conduct foreign policy, maintain an army, establish post offices and wage war. Other areas, such as education, were state responsibilities. 4 years later, 10 amendments, collectively known as the Bill of Rights, became part of the Constitution. The Constitution currently has 27 amendments. George Washington was sworn in as the first U.S. president on the 30th of April 1789. The new nation enjoyed relative peace for about 20 years. In 1803, the U.S. doubled its size by purchasing from France the Louisiana Territory, more than 2 million square kilometers of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. In 1845, the Republic of Texas, a former Mexican territory, joined the U.S. The Mexican-American War of 1846–48 ended with U.S. victory and acquisition of the northern part of Mexico, encompassing the present-day states of New Mexico, Nevada, California, Utah, and parts of Arizona, Colorado and Wyoming. The U.S. evolved into a huge nation stretching between 2 oceans, with wide regional differences in politics, culture, economy and resources. In 1812, the U.S. fought with Britain over the British colonies of Upper Canada and Lower Canada. The British colonies remained independent of the U.S. and became the new nation of Canada half a century later, in 1867. In April 1861, a civil war broke out when 11 slave-keeping Southern states formed the Confederacy and seceded from the Union under Abraham Lincoln, who had won his presidency on an anti-slave platform. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves in the Southern states. The war ended with Union victory in April 1865. More than 3 million Americans fought in the war, and more than 600,000 people died. Although slavery was abolished, African Americans did not gain full citizenship, and racial segregation in the South continued for the next 100 years. The purchase of Alaska in 1867 and the annexation of Hawaii in 1898 gave the U.S. a northern territory with rich natural resources, and its only tropical state. After a brief war with Spain in 1898, the U.S. secured the independence of Cuba and took control of several Spanish overseas possessions, Puerto Rico, Guam and the Philippines. In the decades after the Civil War, the U.S. saw rapid industrialization, urban growth, technological innovation and corporate consolidation. Most states provided free public education. Great numbers of people continued to arrive, mainly from Europe, to settle in the new land. Immigration quotas were set up for the first time in the 1920s amid fears that the newcomers threatened American jobs and culture. The First World War broke out in 1914, with the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey fighting the Allied powers of Britain, France, Russia and, later, Italy. After German submarines attacked American ships, the U.S. entered the war in April 1917 and played a decisive role in defeating the Central Powers. After the war ended in 1918, the U.S. entered a period of steady growth as the standard of living continued to rise. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave American women the right to vote. In 1929, a stock market crash heralded the three-year Great Depression, with bank failures, business shutdowns and massive unemployment sweeping across the country. The so-called New Deal, introduced by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to lift the U.S. out of the Depression, included measures that have profoundly changed American society. The U.S. declared neutrality when the Second World War broke out in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, but entered the war after the Japanese launched a deadly attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December 1941. The war ended in August 1945, with the defeat of Germany and Italy in Europe and the Japanese surrender after the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U.S. emerged from the war as a superpower, to play a major role in global affairs. The U.S. and the Soviet Union entered the Cold War, which was to last for over 40 years and have a profound effect on U.S. foreign policy and domestic affairs. The post-war U.S. enjoyed phenomenal growth and prosperity along with an unprecedented baby boom. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also called the GI Bill, provided free college or vocational education for returning veterans. African Americans proceeded to win equal civil and voting rights and the desegregation of public schools, with many joining the ranks of the middle class. In the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, women made progress in gaining the same opportunities as men. A major demographic shift was the rising population and political influence of Hispanic Americans. During the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union both undertook massive military buildups, especially in nuclear weaponry, with the result that direct, full-scale warfare would have led to assured mutual destruction. Nevertheless, the US got involved in some regional conflicts, notably the Korean War, 1950-53, and the Vietnam War, 1968-72, as it fought to contain what it considered to be Soviet expansion and the spread of communism. The Cold War ended and the US became the world's only superpower when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The US suffered the most devastating foreign attack on its own soil on the 11th of September 2001, when Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 passenger airplanes and crashed 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York, one into the Defense Department's Pentagon headquarters near Washington, D.C., and one in rural Pennsylvania. President George W. Bush declared global war on terrorism. The actions taken by the U.S. to combat terrorism, from the passage of the Patriot Act to the ousting of the pro-Taliban Afghan government and the invasion and occupation of Iraq, met with mixed results and further divided the nation along political, social and cultural lines. The U.S. today faces many challenges. The situation in Iraq and Afghanistan, crippling national debt and budget deficits that have worsened in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial meltdown, the impending bankruptcy of the social security system, and an educational system that many believe is losing its competitive advantage. Whether the nation will thrive and prosper in these crises, as it has done many times before, remains to be seen.